Good morning. Wow, thank you all for being here so early. I know it's kind of early on a Saturday, and especially for us, we're on fall break here at Vanderbilt. So um, if you don't see a lot of students, it's because we need this break. My name is Terrence Dean. I am a first-year doctoral student here at Vanderbilt in religion, and one of the creators of this symposium. And I'm very excited to have such an elite panel and presentation of papers by scholars, writers, thinkers, activists, and our very own Bishop Walker here from Nashville Community, from Mount Zion Church. Because when I had the idea and the conception for this theme, I was a master's student here, and I was in a course called Theories of Diaspora. And I was assigned to do a presentation on Afrofuturism. And I was upset, because I was like, I don't know what Afrofuturism is, and why is the professor assigning me to do this at the end of the course, and I have to do all this research? I could have did something else that I'm more familiar with. And so once I started researching about Afrofuturism, I immediately became captivated because I felt this is the work that I've been doing my entire life. And I finally found something that gave me voice and gave me understanding into the research and work that I was interested in doing. So I want to thank Ytasha Womack, who's here. She's one of the panelists, because she wrote the book on Afrofuturism, and it was her book that helped me to connect and make the dots for me in my research. So I want to thank the esteemed sponsors who were excited and got on board with this idea. As crazy as it was, I was coming in as a PhD first-year student. People thought I was out of my mind to do something like this, to try and create something and pull something like this together, especially here at Vanderbilt. My very own department, the Homiletics and Liturgics department, my major advisor, Professor Dale Andrews, who's back there in the back, could you wave your hands, who totally believed in me and made this possible. My minor advisor, Professor Victor Anderson here, Victor Anderson, who supported it, he kept saying, I don't understand this stuff. What is this stuff you're talking about? He could never get it right. He used to always call, you interested in this Afrofuturist stuff? I said, no, Professor Anderson, it's Afrofuturism. But he finally got it, and he was so excited to be a part of this. I want to thank the Department of African American Diaspora Studies, Professor Tracy Sharpley-Whiting, who came on board. They became a sponsor. Shatika Brown, is Shatika in here? I don't think she's in here. With the Kelly Miller Smith Institute on Black Cultural Studies, Black Church Studies, the Carpenter Program for Women Gender Studies, Cal Turner Program, the Bishop Joseph Johnson Center, Black Seminarians, Good Men. Everyone came on board, so I'm very excited. And so we're going to get our panel started, and I'm going to introduce our moderator for today, which is Professor Tracy Sharpley-Whiting. She is a feminist scholar and Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Distinguished Professor of French in the Department of French and Italian here at Vanderbilt University in the College of Arts and Sciences. She is also the director of African American and Diaspora Studies, as well as the W.T. Bandy Center for Baudelaire, in modern French studies. She is the editor of The Speech, Race and Barack Obama's A More Perfect Union, and editor of the academic journal Pomset, a journal on women, gender, and the Black International. Michael Eric Dyson has described her as a rising star among Black public intellectuals and one of the country's most brilliant and prolific racial theorists. Sharpley-Whiting was named one of the top 100 leaders of the African American community by The Root, an online magazine founded by scholar Henry Louis Gates Jr. She received in 2006 the Horace Mann Medal from Brown University. The award is given annually by the Brown Graduate School to an alumnus or alumna who has made significant contribution in his or her field, inside or outside of the academy. Sharpley-Whiting received her PhD in French Studies from Brown in 1994. Her book, Pimps Up, Holds Down, Hip-Hop's Hold on Black Women, received the Emily Toth Award for the best single work by one or more authors in women's issues and popular and American culture in a specific year from the Popular Culture Association, American Culture Association. In 2007, Sharpley-Whiting testified before Congress at the hearing, From Imus to Industry, the Business of Stereotypes and Degrading Images. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce Professor Tracy Sharpley-Whiting.
Okay, I've actually been instructed to ask my panelists to begin to take their seats so that they can introduce themselves, as well as provide us with a brief synopsis of their work and how their work connects with this larger theme of Afrofuturism, not futurist, as Victor Anderson would say. And so we will begin once everyone is seated. We should probably just begin immediately to my right and continue on. So we'll begin with Ytasha Womack.
Hi, my name is Ytasha Womack. I'm the author of the book Afrofuturism. Prior to writing Afrofuturism, I wrote a book called Post-Black, How a New Generation is Redefining African American Identity. I also co-edited a book called Beats, Rhymes, and Life, What We Love and Hate About Hip Hop. And I wrote a book, a sci-fi book called Rayla 2212 that follows a woman who lives on a planet 200 years into the future and her time travel adventures. However, I'm a filmmaker as well. I've directed and produced films that have been in the American Black Film Festival, and I'm currently developing a new project. And in general, I am just really excited about Afrofuturism and its ability to build bridges, to help people to see beyond their present circumstances and to see a lineage of sorts. So I'm delighted that we're talking about Afrofuturism here today. I'm also delighted that we're talking about it in the context of theology, because I first connected to Afrofuturism in part because I came out of the New Thought philosophy, and that was a spiritual training that was a big part of my foundation and gave me a lot of insight. So, yes, this is great. And I'm from Chicago.
All right.
That's significant.
Amen.
I'm Joseph Walker. I'm the pastor of the Mount Zion Church here in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm a student of learning. I absolutely am excited about the opportunity to be here and to glean. I recognize the incredible bridge between the academy and the church, in particular around this issue. For me, the demographic of my congregation is quite unique, with 70% of the congregation being between the ages of 18 to 35. And so clearly how theology impacts that generation and understanding hip-hop and Afrofuturism, et cetera, is important to me because I recognize that the presentation of the gospel message, how we represent the message of love, how we understand this generation's activism as well as their passion is important in being relevant as we move forward as a church, as a body. So I'm excited about being here and, again, just being a student. So thank you.
Good morning. My name is Tamura Lomax, and I am a professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. I got my PhD here in religion, and in addition to religion, I work with Tracy and AADS, but I also did gender studies this year as well, so I float in between religious studies, African American studies, and women in gender studies. So I've been there for a while. So I have this interest in mirroring these three things between race, gender, and religion in all things that I do. So in addition to being a professor, I'm also the co-founder and CEO of the Feminist Wire. And the Feminist Wire is an online feminist publication with about 1.5 million readers per year. And in that publication, we have a threefold emphasis. And that threefold emphasis is on feminism, anti-imperialism, and racism, and anti-racism. So we are kind of that space that really has this feminist gaze that is accessible, but is also smart, that really, really focuses on race and also anti-imperialism. So I have a book that just came out, it's an edited volume on Tyler Perry that again marries those three things, religion, race, and gender. And then I have a book that I am finishing up, and it is a ode to Bell Hooks' Whose Pussy Is This?, her essay, which is one of my favorite essays that she has written. And I, and that book looks at the representation of Black women and discourse. So this discourse of Black womanhood that circulates within the Black church and also Black popular culture. So I look at T.D. Jakes and Tyler Perry and many others, and I look at their language, the discourse, the representational discourse, and the representational violence that we often see in religion and then also in popular culture, and how Afrofuturism fits in with my work. I have to say that I'm actually very, very new to Afrofuturism. When I was invited, I thought, well, I do popular culture, like Afrofuturism, what is this? But as I began to look at the work, I got very excited. I had already read Octavia Butler, was very familiar with her work, and I realized how important her work was to mine in terms of creating a different future for African Americans, especially in terms of how we see race and gender. And I also saw how my work, my technological work with the Feminist Wire, definitely fit into that narrative in terms of going back, right, to tell the story another way, and then creating a different kind of future for us.
I'm Victor Anderson. I've been at Vanderbilt Divinity School 22 years, and I teach race theory, philosophy of religion, Afro-American studies, and ethics in society. And I've written a book called Beyond Ontological Blackness. And I emphasize the word beyond because that's why I'm on this panel today, is because I've always thought of myself as an Afrofuturist. I'm also from Chicago and very, very proud of it, okay? Okay. But in any case, I'm really happy to be here and serve with this panel just for conversation. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Nitrice Gaskins. I just recently received my PhD in digital media from Georgia Tech. My topic, techno-vernacular creativity, innovation, and learning in underrepresented ethnic communities of practice. And that basically is looking at how those ethnic groups, artists, and practitioners engage science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in their work. I've been working with Dr. Ron Eglash out of RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Based on my research, we developed software for students to be able to learn the math and use math and computing to simulate the artwork of artists who are considered Afrofuturist. So it's Afrofuturism, CSD, culturally situated design tools. So my current role, I moved right into, after successfully defending my dissertation, I rolled into a position where I have a STEAM lab in an urban arts high school in Boston Arts Academy, where we explore, it's an experimental space for artists. These students are, it's 40% African American, 40% Latino, and they all are majoring in arts in some way, and they use this lab space, which opened in September last month, as a way to experiment and learn engineering, science, mathematics, and so on. So this is the first, I believe, STEAM lab in an urban arts high school in the country. And so this is all new stuff. There's no blueprint. Atlanta Black Star, they featured me and Rashida Phillips, who's the Afrofuturist Affair. I talk about Afrofuturism and STEAM education and how it connects through technology and mathematics and so on. and how artists are particularly more innovative used through their works as it relates to Afrofuturism.
Okay, thank you. And let me kind of begin. First, I just want to say that Tamura, you brought up 2 points that I thought were really interesting. First was the bell hooks, whose pussy is this essay? And I have to give a little shout out here to Professor Tiffany Patterson, who's in the audience, because of course she introduced me to that essay and to bell hooks in, I'm dating myself here, 1988. And and she, yeah, I'm sorry about that, but you know, so comes with the territory. And so it was, it actually was quite revelatory as well for me. And at that point, that's when we invited bell hooks to campus and had her speak about her essay and what it was she was trying. She was, of course, very, you know, up and coming at that point, and so it was very inspirational and certainly influential in terms of my career. I also thought it was fascinating you were bringing up Octavia Butler, because, of course, this is for me, the one author who I identify with this particular moment, movement, and idea. But what I really like to kind of move to is this discussion of post-Black that we've been having. Lately, you know, I've read, gosh, I can't remember his name, but yes, Touré. Okay, I know he had a one-name moniker. And so, yeah, Touré's post-Black, and certainly your work. I would like to kind of think about in what ways do they intersect, this notion of post-Blackness and Afrofuturism? Do they not intersect at all? What do we mean when we say post-Blackness? And what exactly do we mean? I think, Tamura, you did a pretty good job, but for those who may not really be familiar with Afrofuturism, you know, what do we mean when we say Afrofuturism?
Well, I can say that when I wrote the book Post-Black, I was very clear that I was not saying post-racial, and devoted the first chapter of my book to explaining what the book was not about because of all of the angst around the phrase post-Black. But when I was writing post-Black, the idea was that because there is increased access, that the ideas around Blackness were just expanding, and that there was just a wider range of expression within that. And at the time, not as much dialogue about that level of diversity. And so I saw it as a possible bridge to what could be post-racial, but we weren't quite there yet. And it was just an exploration of these new elements of diversity within the culture and how they were reshaping the culture. So that was the point. It wasn't to say that all was over and we've won the war necessarily. And it was a lot of fun to write it because it was I began writing it around the time Barack Obama announced his presidency, and then the book was finished around the time he actually won. So that was a unique backdrop for the writing. Now in that, I began really looking at the idea of race as this construct, or as this creation, or as this fatal invention, as Dorothy Roberts noted. And it increasingly became a big part of my conversations, and in that, I discovered the term Afrofuturism. Now, the concepts I had been introduced to before. So Afrofuturism is an intersection between Black culture, technology, the imagination, and liberation. And then I like to say it also infuses mysticism, too. And that bridges a host of ideas, but it's also a way of looking at alternative possibilities, alternative realities, alternative futures through a Black cultural lens. So my personal exploration of post-Black, right, evolved into looking at Afrofuturism and saying, okay, this is a way for people to claim an identity, but also to push beyond limitations that they might associate with race, to get at who they truly are, and then to express from that vantage point. So for me, that was the relationship. I didn't write post-Black thinking I would write Afrofuturism, but in retrospect, I see that there's a very strong connection in terms of who am I, and wanting to express beyond the confines that not only society places within you, but sometimes the confines within the culture itself, and to really look at forms of expression, but then also to look at how you can hijack your own imagination by these ideas of who others say you are or what you feel you're supposed to be doing. And so in that sense, I think Afrofuturism is very much a mechanism to push past our own limitations associated with race. Now, those limitations don't have to be based in a sense of lack necessarily. It doesn't mean that you don't feel empowered as a person necessarily, but it can mean just this process of seeing a person's color and then immediately ascribing a set of traits or having an immediate assumption around a person's lifestyle or have an immediate sense of anger or angst. These sorts of things complicate not only our own personal lives, but complicates how we interact as people. And so if we can push past that to actually be who you really are, that's the liberation. And that's that point of intersection. And that's the part that's kind of exciting to me. When you look at people who won't create certain artistic forms because they feel, oh, as a person of African descent, is this something I should be doing? Well, that is limiting a person's expression. It's limiting their ability to be who they truly are. And, you know, outside of just the African influenced cultures themselves, looking at other cultures, if other people limit who they are and what they connect to based around these ideas of color, then that's a problem as well. You know, a lot of people connect with the ideas of Afrofuturism because it gets into nonlinear thinking, as I know Nettrice could talk about extensively. So for me, that's the relationship, and that's the point of liberation.
Not everybody has to speak if they don't want to, but I think yes, you'd like to.
I just wanted to kind of expound and add to that, because I think it's one of the things that I found very interesting and compelling about Afrofuturism is this notion of the kind of the Sankofa moment and making sure that we go back, right? To go back, because post-Black, it does sometimes signify mistakenly like post-racial, and that's something that we definitely want to resist because we're definitely still living in a racist society, right? Where race is definitely active in a very specific kind of way, and it's regulating in specific kinds of ways, but Blackness is too, so it's important to kind of go back and be clear about like the historical grounding of Blackness, but yet to understand Blackness as a space of plurality. So I'm thinking specifically, as Ytasha was talking, I was thinking specifically about two things. Marlon Riggs' Black is, Black ain't, where he really creates a space of questioning what Black is and what Black isn't, and he created space for us to imagine, right? She spoke about to imagine different kinds of Blacknesses, right? Different ways of being, like so owning the past and being clear about the past, but also imagining different ways of being and creating space for different kinds of subject positionalities where people can perform their Blackness in different kinds of ways. But I'm also thinking about, finally, I'm also thinking about George Clinton and how George Clinton, when he created the Funkadelic in Parliament, and how he was very clear that he wanted to use the space of outer space because he felt like the space, right, that we live in, Blackness had already been defined. And so he was really kind of pushing back against that. So post-Blackness to me represents this very creative space where we're very clear about the past, but that we're imagining. It's a play space where we can play and we can imagine Blackness being a variety of things.
Okay, I'm using a different mic. Okay, so I write for PBS Art 21, artists in art in the 21st century. And I've been doing that since 2009. In June of this year, I wrote a piece called Black Futurism, the Creative Destruction and Reconstruction of Race in Contemporary Art, which apparently is very popular. Some group in Sweden wanted to republish it. But in that, I quote a professor out of Georgia State University, Alessandra Ringo, who reflects on this assertion that in contemporary culture, Blackness is able to travel, quote unquote, travel on its own, separate and distinct from Black people. So we have this issue of the booty, which has now been separated now, and cornrows that are now vogue is saying, oh, look, you know, we even invented cornrows. What's her name? Kylie Jenner wore some cornrows, and look how edgy she is. So there are certain aspects of Blackness that are able to travel. And so in the blog piece, I also mentioned there was an art exhibition called Liquid Blackness. And right now there's kind of this zeitgeist in Afrofuturism where we have this resurgence of issues that were kind of kicked around in the late 80s and early 90s, where artists are beginning to explore some of the same issues but in new ways. And so artists like Wangechi Mutu, who's exploring both gender and race issues, and also her being someone from Africa in the United States as a female. And we have other artists who are really exploring what happens when you cut away the Blackness. Where do you put, and then putting it back into the frame, what does it look like when you are remixing it and changing it? And so I think there's this huge domain, this huge sort of group of artists that are doing this amazing work that's getting a lot of international acclaim, but they all kind of touch on Afrofuturism. And all of them, if you go to an Afrofuturism art exhibition, you're going to see these artists over and over again. So it's very interesting, this idea. The other thing I wanted to say, Beth Coleman is another scholar. She wrote an essay called Race as Technology. And you mentioned it actually in your book, so in the Afrofuturism book. And that also she's pulling from James A. Sneed, who passed away many years ago, who begins to look at repetition in the cut in Black creative expression. So not just in visual images, but also in music, on the one. And then what happens when you're mixing that, and what happens when Sun Ra is doing that, and what happens when it's in funk. And it just comes up again and again. So there's this huge creative domain of work that fits into Afrofuturism that I think we have and we can begin to talk about, both in the past and the present, but also artists who are thinking about what it means to be Black and what Blackness means in the future.
Okay. Victor, you put it down so you have nothing to say. All right, I just want to make sure I got that. All right. All right, so I'd like to move on to talk a little bit more specifically about the Black church and the practice of Afrofuturism in that context. I'm very, very interested in praxis, and so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that.
Well, thank you. I really believe it really is an amazing time, particularly in the Black church, because many churches are using technology in an innovative way to really make the message more relevant. For me, the use of technology, the use of a creative, if I may say, a creative hermeneutic, if you will, a presentation of the gospel message that really heightens a person's awareness to the social ills that's not in the normal box, if you will. But I think that for me, what I'm seeing in the Black church, and of course I can't speak for the entire Black church, but just in my context, I'm seeing a tremendous energy really around pushing the envelope, dealing with those issues that are in the community, but from a very non-traditional perspective. I think clearly the church in its own identity is evolving. I think those things that folks are very passionate about are continuing to evolve, and I think the responsibility of the pastor in those situations, one, is to be a good student of what these students or what these congregants are passionate about, to put oneself in a position to be sensitive to the plight of those in the pew, and to create what I believe a healthy model that really addresses those issues from a perspective that is relevant, practical, and folks really feel that their needs are being met. As I sit here, and I'm tremendously impressed by what I'm hearing, because it's helping me even as a leader, as a pastor, and a little bit more about my context. Again, I talk about the church that I pastor, but I have a unique opportunity that is evolving before me now and reaching and touching millions of people around the world and helping to shape, I think, the ethos of the religious community where I live, if you will. And I think this is really helpful for me because, again, I'm using technology every day. We have a virtual reach. For us, virtual congregation, if you will. It's folks who never will set foot in the original church, never will come to the physical structure, but we reach them through a variety of tools that are available to us in this generation. So I believe that's really practically how the message can be transferred into the larger culture of the church redefining itself outside of the four walls of brick and mortar.
I think when you talk about post-blackness, I think in terms of Bell Hook's notion of postmodern blackness, which is a positive signifier that says that if you take postmodern blackness seriously, you have to take seriously the world of difference that constitute who we are. That's going to make a difference how you think about the church. If the world that constitutes ourselves is a world constituted by difference, a difference at all kinds of unimaginable levels in which we here in the black church have not been able to talk about. I'm talking about levels of gender, identity, formation. I'm talking about sexuality. I think one of the hardest things for the black church to come to terms with is how we talk about sex, sexuality, and particularly that borderline, that more difficult language of what do we do with transgender, transsexuality, as it is also part of who we are in our identities and formation within the context of blackness and difference. And when it comes to the black church would not be the progressive institution it once was until it learns to rethink itself. It must learn to rethink itself within the framework of the world of difference. I hope that ain't me. I ain't good at technology. I got all these people like, that ain't me, okay? Okay. And so the black church, as church, not black, but as church, understand that we're part of a global network. A network that is transnational, international, constituting millions of people through television, to televangelism, through languages and all like. The black church continue to be a micro entity within a growing cosmopolis. And part of imagining Afrofuturism in the black church is imagining the black church as not black church, but as church, growing, understanding, organism, constituting people with needs, people with understanding, people who bring intelligence, people who bring imagination, people who can reimagine the gospel. I mean, that's something of when I think about Afrofuturism in the black church, I think not about the past, which black theology has really been stuck in the past. I think it's been stuck on a lot of mantras, but one of its mantras is the mantra of history. We turn to history in the past in order to understand and keep ourselves in check. Brandon McCormick is here. He wrote a book on moral panic. We turn to the past of our ancestors, like to keep our moral identities and all of the ways in which we shape ourselves in check. But it's about the present. The future is always the present. The future is the present that's being formed right now. So Afrofuturism, the black church, has to find a way of really galvanizing the imagination of people to dream differently. And I'm an old queen. I dream in color. Okay? I dream in color. And that's part of the beauty of, I think, when the black church can dream in color, and not just in terms of the black project. I think we'll begin to see a lot of growth, and I think you will begin to see more people attending to the gospel in new ways.
You know, I really appreciate how you talked about the relationship between the past and the future as it connects with Afrofuturism, because that's what separates it from just traditional futurism or general sci-fi, that there is this very core understanding that time is cyclical, that the future is now, and that the past and the future are intricately connected. And there is this active work to pull from the best of the past to kind of leapfrog over the transatlantic slave trade experience and what came after it to get to this point of understanding and reclaim a lot of that wisdom and knowledge and sense of self and integrate that with who we are now and project it into the future. So you see it in the artwork. You see that in the music. You know, you can look at images. Even if you look at the Afrofuturism book cover, you know, it's an image that on the one level looks like it could be a cyborg of sorts, but then it also pulls from traditional African elements, and you can see that in the hair, you can see that in some of the elements that reflect mask work, and that's very intentional. I think that at the heart of Afrofuturism, there is this question of spirituality. So when we talk about the Black church, you know, I mentioned I came out of a New Thought experience, which I'll share greatly a little later, but it was a mega church environment. It was a majority Black environment, and it was headed by a woman who ran it for 50 years. And one of the core things she emphasized was also another point that you made, which was the imagination, and using the imagination to transcend your circumstances and to create your own life and to create your own experience. Now, when that was in the early years of her conversations around this, that was a notion that was heavily criticized. You know, within the construct of what we call race, can you create your own experiences? There are a lot of people who would fight you tooth and nail around that, right? In the context of, you know, to say something like you are God in expression, or you're a creation, or you are created by God, or you are expressing as God, or in some cases, depending on the religious perspective, you are God, walking around in a specific plane. These are things that challenge some of our traditions around how Christianity in some way is structured and how in some ways it's taught. So it's interesting because when we talk about the church today, I think that one connection a lot of people are trying to make is looking at how they can take the essence of Christianity as they might practice it and connect it with some of these other thought forms that might connect with how we talk about spirituality, how they might connect with either traditional African religions or African-derived religions or Hinduism or Buddhism, and see, well, what is the core relationship here? And how do I integrate that? And can I talk about that in a church context? You know, is that okay? And I think that's part of the search and the quest that people are looking for. So you can't, I think there's a relative understanding that you can't practice your faith without the recognition that other people have other beliefs. How is this integrated into who we are? And I think that that's something that people are really looking for. I think it explains in some ways what we might call a disconnect for some people with the more traditional church. But it's not just the traditional church that people are disconnected with. All traditional entities related around religion are having some challenges in building these bridges because people are looking for how does this connect with the other aspects of the world and how other people express. And so I think Afrofuturism is one way of facilitating or having this conversation to say that there is a relationship. There is a relationship between some of these things when you look at the core essence of who we are, whether you want to connect that to the universe or a broader cosmic or spiritual identity or however you would like to explain it. But in so doing, it does lend itself to other conversations around theology. And I think that's the opportunity, or what some might call the challenge, in looking at this from a spiritual perspective.
So I wanted to make one point, a separate point, and then I want to go back to Victor's points. So I'm reading from my phone. I'm not texting. So I use technology in a variety of ways. So I want to, when I was thinking about Afrofuturism in the Black church, I thought I wanted to broaden more and think about Black religion and Black religiosity, right, which is irreducible to the Black church. Black church is an aspect. And I thought immediately of the enslaved, the ex-slave ancestors. And one of the things that I wrote was that the religion of the ex-slaves, which was inherently plural, was in many ways Afrofuturistic in terms of the ways in which they merged spirituality, myth, time travel, and imagination to achieve a new truth. So I think there's always been this connection, right? We just didn't have the language to Afrofuturism, but there's always, they were definitely thinking about a new future. They were definitely thinking about, when they thought about heaven, they were thinking about, right, creating this different kind of future. So there was both this borrowing from times past as well as this creation that they were imagining. So I wanted to make that point, but then I wanted to go back to Victor and his point, specifically about sexuality and sex and how, and I'm going to talk a lot more about this in my paper, but the Black church, in terms of where it stands, I think that it's very important that the Black church take a critical, not a romantic, but a critical look, right? So we don't want romantic nostalgia. What we want is a critical look at the past in order to create a different kind of space, creative space, specifically around the areas of sex, right? So sex in terms, not just sex in terms of biological sex, sex in terms of identities, but also sex in terms of what people do. Right, so in my talk, I'm going to talk about sexual violence, because in my book that I am writing on Black popular culture and Black religion, there are way more comparisons than we think between Black popular culture and Black religion in terms of sexual violence and in terms of, and when I say sexual violence, I mean sexual violence in a variety of ways, right? In terms of in terms of epistemic violence, in terms of actual rape. Right? So there are a lot of comparisons that we can make. So the Black church really needs to kind of rethink itself in terms of its gender categories, but also the ways in which it perpetuates, right, the epistemes and kinds of violences of modernity.
Okay. What I'd like to do is kind of talk about a bit about the politics of Afrofuturism. I guess I'm thinking, certainly I would like to imagine it as progressive. But we've mentioned hip-hop, and of course, many people don't necessarily think about hip-hop as progressive. And I could remember the poet Hakeem Madhubuti saying at one point that it was easy to rap about a ghetto, but it's more difficult, it seems, to imagine a paradise, right, or a future. And this was in the 80s when he said this. And so I'm kind of wondering, how do we, particularly those of you who incorporate Black popular culture, hip-hop, which is a part of Black popular culture, although everyone seems to want to reduce Black popular culture to just hip-hop. I would like to kind of, for us to kind of parse that particular question a bit.
I have a chapter in a book called Meet Me at the Fair, World's Fairs Over Time, and I look at the Unisphere specifically and its relationship in hip-hop. And what I found is, the Sun Ra was really interested in this particular World's Fair in '64 because of its space theme. And also, I started to realize in a lot of music videos and album covers, the Unisphere kept popping up. So I focused on Craig Mack's Flavor in Your Ear, which was produced by Hype Williams. And he's actually placed in front of the Unisphere in that video. It's very much about Jetsons. He talks about technology and science. And this was kind of the mid-'90s at that time. And, the Beastie Boys actually have the Unisphere on the inside cover of License to Ill. And then I found that even Talib Kweli, so we moved from in front of the Unisphere first, and to go back to '64, that was actually a really big issue because the person who was the architect of that World's Fair was basically creating a city divided. So you had where he created bridges that were so low that people from the ghettos could not get to the beaches and get to the areas where the World's Fair was located, because he intentionally wanted to make sure that certain people didn't get to the beaches, and that's the person who's the architect of the World's Fair. So there's protests around that in the '60s and things like that. So there was this exclusion thing happening, and then a resurgence of it in the '80s and '90s in hip-hop. And so you have this connection with Sun Ra, but you also have this connection with rappers and with rap producers and music video directors that were really interested in the kind of space, sci-fi, technology-related topics and themes we talk about in Afrofuturism. So, to bring it forward, Talib Kweli's in this world videos from 2010, and instead of standing in front of the Unisphere, he is the Unisphere. So the rings go around him. So it's now placing in the center of the world. as opposed to placed around it or excluded from it. So that's what kind of where we are now. It's 4 years after the fact, but you see that in hip hop, this story of how we've taken these artifacts of space and space travel and time travel, and how it's had an impact on hip hop.
Any other responses? No? Okay. I'm actually about to open the floor, so because I do think that some discussion from the audience is important. So, okay.
So, the album cover for Planet Rock Don't Stop is the Unisphere for the remix, just so you know.
Well, I think it's interesting because, of course, as you say, it's old school, and most people don't know, a lot of people don't know old school, unfortunately, and a lot of people don't think of, they're not going back that far. So what do we do in the present moment to talk a bit about, how to incorporate that? Is it just impossible? Do we simply say that is, it's part of our present, and so how does it connect with that? It certainly will have an impact on our future. It already has a serious impact on our present. So I gather, I like old school too, but for very different reasons than, but there's some of the new stuff that I find interesting. I listen to a little, things that I probably shouldn't. But anyway, okay.
Well, I think the imagination is twofold, right? I think there's the imagination in terms of what you envision that you can actively create. There is this idea that you have to see something in your mind to achieve it, or at least feel it very strongly. But I think the other side is what we might call visioning. And visioning is, in a sense, when you connect with an image that already exists, right? Whether it's from the past or whether it's from the future or whether it's something that's happening now. And your connection with that image informs you. So essentially, I guess it's still rooted in feeling. There are people is there anyone here who does like these map boards? If there's things that they want, they cut pictures and they put it up. And that's one way of visualizing it. But usually it's the feeling that's connected with it. Some people, they can't actually see an image, but they have a very strong feeling connected with things. And so that helps to create the activity or create your own experience. So I think it's informed from two different spaces. And that's what makes, I think, Afrofuturism really interesting, because there's room to have an active conversation about that beyond the levels of, are you an actual artist, right? Just as a practice in life of being able to create things as you see it and to be informed from other perspectives, other times, and other ways that can help you get more insight into how you're supposed to move forward as well.
The imagination is the most powerful faculty we have as human beings. In the academy and in the history of scholarship, we have always stressed knowledge, our capacity to know. Our capacity to know is so minimal to the power of the imagination. The power of imagination is the power of projection. It is to project possibilities out of, this is me, out of shit. To project possibilities when your back is against a wall is one of the most powerful things about the imagination. The arts is the arts are the quintessential expression of imagination, but so is the ways in which we think about each other. The ways in which we talk to each other are also float on the field of imagination. The way we greet each other already comes together with pictures we have of each other. The imagination is filled with, I fill our minds with pictures, with voices. The past doesn't even come alive as past. History makes no sense unless the voices of history rise to us in the present as living voices and breathing voices. That's where the power of spirituality. The imagination is the key to how we feel our way in the world, and it's also the way in which we feel our way into the future. This is why songwriting and writing poetry, this is why painting and the arts are so important, because it keeps people like me who stay in books alive with new images. This is why I hang around with so many younger people, because they feel this old mind with new possibilities of thinking, hey, I never really thought about that before. That makes sense to me. The imagination is the most lively thing we can endorse, that we can promote, and that we need to educate more. The control of the imagination is slavery.
There's something seriously wrong with the educational system in terms of the elite that are supposed to be the future leaders. And I notice I say supposed to be, because we have a generation who have been told that they're brilliant, that they're great, and they're coming out of schools which have regimented them, have taught them to memorize and study for tests. So when they run into a teacher that says, you have to think this through, as a student told me just this past week, her failure was my problem, because she didn't want to remember the 5 other readings that she was supposed to read from that far back. She just wanted regimentation. She actually said that to me. So we have to ask ourselves, when you say teach, how do we teach to excite the imagination? And to me, that even connects with the question of politics. What is the politics of knowledge and the politics of learning? Could somebody address that?
Just a moment.
I just came out of some hazing, a lot of hazing. You know, I actually taught at Georgia Tech. I taught computational media students, and the struggle they have with critical thinking is something that it saddens me, actually. They are not asked to think critically about the content that they consume. And that has an impact on what they produce. And beyond testing, because I think that's another related, and now I'm in an urban arts high school challenged with also meeting test scores, but also keeping that art alive in the young person. And that's a real struggle, because you have two things happening. And I think the faculty struggle with that. I think it's not just an issue for parents and students, but it's the faculty that has to figure out where they are in this thing. These institutions that we're currently in are highly privatized. It's really much a business model as opposed to about humanities, or about, you know, these things are something that it's everywhere we look. I think that the resurgence, and I had said this to a reporter for U.S. News World Report, that this resurgence in Afrofuturism, I think, is part of a fight, a response to this highly institutionalized, privatized world we live in. And I think the artists are reflecting that in their work through Afrofuturistic type of themes, even if they don't call themselves Afrofuturist. I use the word Black futurism, there's Afro-surrealism. There are lots of different ways you can approach this topic, but it's pretty much the same ideas. We're trying to remix and change and alter and disrupt the system. So, and so I just wanted to say that.
One more point then for the panel three. As I listen to you talk about post-racial, post-blackness, I've had problems with those terms. I got problems with any of them as post. But I think in an age when we're producing non-critical learners, So as we throw these terms out, think about who's absorbing them and what their limited imaginations will do with them.
You know, it's really interesting because when I always like to talk about things in context, right? As many of us do, because it helps to orient something. But that's because I'm a fundamentalist. You know, I believe that it helps to know the fundamentals of a thing in order to move forward. Now, that's just something that was drilled into me as a learning process. But it's not a learning process for everyone, and not always necessary. So you don't have to start from what we think is the beginning, which could be the orientation of blackness, right? No. I'm not. I'm just using that hypothetically to move to another point. So if someone interacts with these ideas from the standpoint of Afrofuturism, or from the standpoint of saying, okay, I'm talking about something from the context of it being different or having changed, then that's just where their point of entry for the conversation. So I don't think it has to, in and of itself, limit them, because there is a reality of constructs changing. So I think that when we talk about this idea of the imagination can push you past a specific construction, whether that's race, whether that's gender, whether that's institutionalism. And what we find, even if you have people who we think have limited imaginations, they can still access this information in what may seem like a very backwards way. And that's often the case, where they're starting from, say, knowing nothing, and then not necessarily seeing constructions or seeing how things connect, and then they make their own connections, which helps them to navigate life as they so choose. Now, we could argue that that's not a valid construction, right, because of how we happen to be oriented. But if there's a space for someone to live a life through a series of connections that they make, that expresses a range of freedoms that certain people may have today that they did not always have, okay, where they can believe one set of things and live happily, and then I can believe another set of things and live happily if I so choose. So I think sometimes it's that we want people to process information in the same way that we processed it. And I don't know if we can always guarantee that sort of thing. You know, the same way if we go back a couple hundred years, you know, I might not process something in the same way that other people processed it at that time either. I'm working with a different set of information. And they could say, you know, well, you're not starting at the beginning, or their perspective of what the beginning is. Do you see where I'm kind of going with this? I think that as people who are in education, we're very fundamental about how people learn and what key ideas they should leave with. And it's kind of interesting that there is some range of choice around what ideas people choose to take with them, and the fact that they can build around that. So it just lends itself, I think, to the fact that we will not be able to always operate in these rigid constructions of identity or ideas, and that what seems like a rejection of that, or in some ways a lack of critical analysis, is also a rejection of seeing those things in specific constructions.
I want to really quick, I want to make a quick point, because I want to push back, because on one hand, I think that it's important to have the space for imagination, and it's important, like, you know, to really resist this notion that blackness is already defined, because blackness has been defined in some very fucked up ways, you know, that we need to be very honest about, right? So I get pushing back against that, but I also get the question, and I think it's important in the point, because when we talk about post, there's this assumption, right, that we are now beyond in a different space, and so we no longer have these constructs, not in terms of the constructs that we want to push back against, but the constructs that really push against us, right? That push our backs against the wall in particular kinds of ways because we are black. So we get let's not act like Raven-Symoné did not just happen, right? Where Raven-Symoné is talking to Oprah and she's like, well, you know, I'm not African American. Don't call me that, right? So those are the students that I get. I get young students who don't want to identify as anything, not acknowledging the fact that these racial, sexual, sex constructs, they already exist, right? So when we have post-blackness, there is a concern. So we do want to push back against the negative ways that blackness has been defined, but we also want to be very careful because language, once we put it out there in the universe, like there's no control over it. And I get very concerned about what post-blackness may mean, right, to the younger generations who may not have the historical narrative that we have. So yes, people come to blackness in different kinds of ways, but this could be very dangerous because the assumption could be that that no longer matters, that no longer defines our lives. And in this society, when we begin to think that blackness no longer defines our lives, we could very well end up dead, right? So blackness is still very much defining us, so we just kind of want to be careful there.
Right, and that's, I think, at the heart of the question. It's about the politics of this sort of politics that we're talking about, because inevitably we're not talking about, you know, we can have plurality of identities in the way in which we understand certain things, but without historical context it becomes particularly dangerous, but even at the present moment. And also, this isn't like we're talking about a, you know, Booker T. Washington versus Du Bois kind of tension around what black folks need and, you know, how to do the come up, right? This is about, you know, some serious folks saying, taking post-blackness and saying, this is not who I am. This is not what we need to be talking about. We've moved beyond that. And how dangerous they can be politically to those of us who are trying to be progressive on these particular questions of anti-black racism and sexism and homophobia. I'm going to take this question and then I'll let you respond, because I know you want to respond to that, because he's had his hand up for a while.
I am with the spiritual herald newspaper, and I want to first of all compliment whoever designed this lecture hall, because it is the most futuristic lecture hall I've seen. And if you had seen the lecture of the instructors here from Australia, you would know that this is a lecture hall of the future. And I want to make a comment on the church. Also the church, as well as Sir Winston Churchill. Some of you see the movie Criminal Minds. There's a quote in here: the further you go back, the further you can see your way into the future. And if you can't go back, that means you are in a time warp. And in reference to the church, the late Dr. Samuel Proctor said, our churches today, the noise in our churches are noise without joy. And the noise that you do hear, he said, are awful noises. And if we can't go back, I'm from Alabama, and I'm not ashamed of that, and I'm of the persuasion that I'm a product of the soundest First Baptist church in the state of Alabama. And I know how to gauge congregations in gatherings like this, because the late Dr. N.A. Smith Jr. in Birmingham taught me how to gauge a gathering. So I just wanted to make those points in order to generate conversation and thought. But if you can't go back, or if you're ashamed of your elders, I have about 30-something elders that I play the music of Dr. J. Robert Bradley over the telephone. And I think that his voice contains the future of America, because he was the favorite singer of Dr. MLK Jr. And I said so much because they impressed me when I come to these places.
Okay, I'd like to let you go ahead and respond. Ytasha.
You know what, it's okay, you can take a question.
Okay, all right. Okay, take your question. Right here. Okay, now take yours and go back to you,
We
Terrence.
saw 6 years ago something that was extremely disturbing in the sense that we saw one of our voices muzzled, and not even literally, but politically muzzled with Dr. Jeremiah Wright. Okay, so
I guess I feel as a Chicagoan, I feel kind of responsible. That particular church isn't too far away from my house. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Were you? Okay. Yeah. You know, I think it's well, reality number one. There's technology in churches now, so what you say is going to be recorded and it can go out to the world. We understand that now. I think you can say what you want to say. You just have to be prepared to back it up. And if you can back it up and you can be able to explain it to your particular congregation and to anyone else, I think there is a space for that. Now, what's new is this global potential condemnation. You know, there was also another minister in the same city, who I'm sure you're familiar with, who wanted to run for mayor, but he had made a lot of anti-gay statements on the pulpit. And then, you know, he said, oh, I didn't make these statements. And then you go back to the tapes and the CDs, and you see, yes, he did make these statements, right? So the idea that, you know, what you say in the church stays in the church, like what you say in Vegas stays in Vegas, you know, it doesn't quite work like that anymore. So there just has to be, fortunately or unfortunately, and to be honest with you, this applies to everyone. You have to say things that you can stand firm on. And if you change your mind around something, be very open to saying, you know what, I felt that way then, I felt that way very strongly then, and now I don't quite feel that way. So I think the question becomes people who are saying things that they don't really believe, because, and I'm not saying this applies to Jeremiah Wright necessarily, but they're saying things, and then, you know, when they step outside of that space, they want to navigate as if those things weren't necessarily said. So in Jeremiah Wright's case, I think, yes, there was a lot of criticism, but then there was also a lot of room afterwards because people said, you know, this is kind of messed up. You know, he said these things, and a lot of people understood that it was taken out of context, and there was a space to have that addressed. And then when that space to have it addressed took place, which I want to say was with the press club, he was in a space where he was so angered by what had happened. Because when you go from, you know, being loved, being adored, being able to say whatever you want to say, and now you're on television every 2 seconds, that has an impact on someone. You know, if you're, you know, it's not like he was this big celebrity and he's used to that level of criticism. I think it had a big impact, and I think that impact compromised how he was able to explain what it was that he said. And then it was that opportunity that complicated the issue, probably even more so than what was actually said in the church that they blew up. And so with that, the question of, in his case, in my opinion, I think the issue was not so much what he said that was exposed, but how do you then deal with, as an individual, and this is something many of us, you know, may have to work with, how do you deal with this 24-hour media cycle that rotates it over and over and over again, and how that impacts a person, you know, and their ability to be able to navigate. I mean, with celebrities, we laugh about it, but many of us take part in it at the same time. So now we're just in a space where that can happen to individual citizens. People are a little more prominent. And I think the church culture was not accustomed to that.
Okay, I wanted to interject really quick because I want to move, thinking about your question, I want to move away from the work that technology does, right? So that's one thing, the work that technology does in terms of it transmits a message, right? Because then we make comparisons that I think are problematic between Jeremiah Wright and Jamal Bryant, right? Because they both use, like, that's not a comparison that we should be making, because these are two different people with two different standpoints, two different histories, two different kinds of ideological positionalities, right? So I think we need to get back to really Dr. Patterson's question in terms of the politics of knowledge, because that's what it boils down to, the politics of knowledge in terms of what gets to be knowledge and what does not, right? So Jeremiah Wright was silenced several years ago because that was not a popular standpoint in terms of the politics of knowledge. The politics of knowledge silenced him in that moment, not technology. It was the politics around what could be seen as truth and what could not be seen as truth in that moment.
Okay, I'm going to take the question here. They're going to puzzle that one over. All right.
So, I mean, yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that I had an aha moment when I started realizing that the Congo cosmogram, as it stands, has a aqua zone in it that is often popping up in a lot of different situations, including in Parliament's Aqua Boogie. And, right, but that exact narrative, that origin, that mythology that was created has many characters. So, and those many characters and philosophies are layered in those lyrics. So this idea of remixing, this idea of all that is very much a theme in Afrofuturism, but it's also something that continues to keep popping up every time I do my research on the cosmogram, which I'll talk about later in my paper. Particularly the water line, the Kalunga line, the water zone, the crossroads, and how many times that comes up in African American popular culture and in the lyrics of Parliament Funkadelic. And something that is passed along to Drexcia, which was an electronic music duo from Detroit that was one of the pioneers of techno. And they have an origin myth of African women who fell overboard on the way in the Middle Passage, created a society underwater called Drexcia. Now, I don't want to get too much into it, it is in my paper, but we can see that these, and also in Flying Lotuses, the music video for Flying Lotus, Until the Quiet Comes, again, Aqua Zone. Why does this pop up again and again in film? Then we got music and literature, and now in visual art. So this is something that's very much inherent, and it's also in Aqua Boogie. So when we talk about these characters that are created in the P-Funk mythology, we're looking at a new way of looking at traditional or past different things that we've picked up and put together because we had to. And I think that's something that I think addresses some of that question about how do we put that in context with what we're talking about here.
Well, it also ties into the myth of Atlantis. And when I think about Derek Bell's Afro-Atlantica, and of course, Clinton fronts that video. So it's quite interesting, those connections. There was a question over here. I guess no more. Okay, you wanted to, and then I'll take your question because it looks like that hand is down over there.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I would say that that's referencing the ego. The ego ran amok. So whether you want to look at it within the space of the conscious and the superconscious and subconscious, or you just want to look at it as far as the conscious mind and the subconscious mind, that aspect of yourself that's all about self-preservation that runs amok and is resistant to being informed and being resilient and open to changing and expanding who you are, and probably claiming this larger cosmic identity that at the end of the day has to be open and receptive and has to be this vessel for higher understanding. And your ego, or what you think is that aspect of yourself that says, no, this is who you are, this is what you're going to do, and this is how you're going to get there, and that's it. I would say that particular song is speaking to that, whether you want to look internally or whether you want to say that that's just a play out between a more masculine and feminized energy on the planet itself.
Okay, taking his class. And then yours.
Biological speculation from American to German 1972, and there's a very important thing that goes on with that, because we're going to talk about Afrofuturism, future, the meat of that sandwich. Do we have a future if we don't preserve this planet? And I think while we're sitting around speculating, we need to figure out a way to save this planet, to recycle this planet before this planet recycles us. Last night I was at the Belcourt watching York's Biophilia Live, and she's been on a 2-year tour. She looks like she stepped off the mothership. I mean, she really does, and it just shows how important and how vital over the last 40 years that Mr. Clinton's work has been in inspiring people around the globe. And I think we need to follow up with some kind of application toward a positive method in what I call speculative fiction. We call it science fiction, but it's truly speculative fiction. It's about speculating what our future is going to be. And I think if we are to have a future, if our great-grandchildren are going to live on this planet, we need to do something. We need to get
Well, I just want to, I'm an artist. My name is Prof. Wilkinson, and I have taught for 25 years on the college level. I'm not affiliated with that now. One I like to give credit to, because we're using terms that have been used before. Futurism is not new, and Afro is not new. Futurism was a short-lived popular movement among visual artists and painters that basically gave you a multi-dimensional view of a scene, a person, an object, and it was like a repetition, but it fast forward each movement to give this multi-spatial relationship. And with George Clinton, we see some of that in his music. He's taking the past, moving to the future, and we're talking about space and the universe, which we know is the origin of all of us. And I think of just the very basics of our party life, the strobe, the light strobe. When we're in a club or even the dance ball, it gives us a multi-dimensional view as we dance and we look at our partner, and they're changing and altering before our eyes in this sort of unreal speculative movement that we can't necessarily predict, because the strobe, some are unpredictable, some aren't. But again, we have these kind of daily relationships with futurism. Certainly an idea creates a creative moment. As a photographer, you know, I'm listening to the words, and I have to say to you, and as much as it may sound I'm being sexist, as much as I admire your words and admire your reputation, and you're just starbound. The hair, the outfit, and that mesmerizes me. Is that futurism, or is that basics? You know, the dog in me when it's So what need to look back at Christmas Adams, the first martyr of freedom in American history. He was described as an aggressive mulatto, a thug. He was a rope maker. But yet, he was killed, the first to be killed in the movement of the American Revolution. And we forget about that. It's not so much in the till. We need to start back before that.
I want to just interject a point really quick, and only because I've been a part of the movement. I've gone to Ferguson. I'm part of Black Lives Matters. It's not the Michael Brown movement. And the people who are the organizers, the youth in Ferguson, who myself and many others have worked with on the ground, are very clear that this isn't even about Michael Brown. I mean, he's a moment in history, but they absolutely do connect what's happening now to the past and their futures, because their concern is that if we don't get it right now, there is no futures for any of us. So they're very clear about that. So this is not a Michael Brown movement. It is a movement against the militarization of the police and police brutality, right? So, and they're very clear about that. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that, just because I'm sorry? He's one of the sparks, but there's so many sparks. There's so many sparks, and there have been so many moments since Michael Brown, unfortunately.
No, please. Listen, black folk have been protesting their condition for 250 years in this country. And I think we have to see the lineage of what people do. I agree with you that it's not a Michael Brown movement, but Tamura's point is incredibly important. The youth, I haven't seen the youth on this campus, despite of the ones who don't think critically. There's some who got up and went. 25 of our students went last week on their own. Okay? And so I don't want to ignore that. And I think what bothers me about, I will agree the generalizations bother me, is that the past is not dead. Okay? The past is very much alive at this present moment, and it's part of the politics. And as you were talking about Jeremiah Wright, for example, what was wrong in the Jeremiah Wright moment is that David Walker said in 1829 that black folks don't have the right to be angry over their condition in this country. And black folks have been angry about their condition, and they're angry in Ferguson. Those police were acting like a Gestapo. And they have been doing that a long time. All Michael Brown did was put a little match to a cinder that was already there. And that's what we forget about, the links between the past and the present. And it's very important we begin to teach that to our youth. Some of them did it on their own here because we have students from Ferguson here. But then you had a whole bunch of students. And keep in mind that futurism, and I think many panelists know this, has always been a part of the black consciousness. If black slaves did not have a sense of future, our behinds would not be sitting over here now.
If I can, I'm sorry, go ahead. No, please. No, go ahead.
My name is Mickey Jones, and my question is related to kind of what we see as dystopian, it seems like it's a current obsession in movies and books. I guess maybe it's part of futurism, but also this love affair with a dystopian future, but it seems like it's a future without people of color, and specifically without black people. I have a teenage daughter, and she's in love with the Hunger Games and The Giver and all of these things, but there are very few black characters. So is Afrofuturism an answer to that, an alternative to that, a totally different thing? And how does that kind of become something for our children to look at the future, and all children and people that are interested in kind of examining and even thinking about the future to look at that, because the dystopian, it seems always kind of very negative. Is Afrofuturism both negative and positive, and how does it deal with it?
There's always duality in everything. So when IBM sponsored me to do a virtual 3D world exhibition on Afrofuturism, there was a dystopia on one side, utopia on the other, and the universe down the center. So the dystopia side had the Marion Wright elements, cradle to prison pipeline, and surveillance as themes. and I had to code the environment so that people who have not experienced what it's like to be watched felt that when they are in the virtual space. So certain objects were coded, eyes follow you. There are things that I had to do to create that creepy sense of always being watched, or that you don't have choices, or you have specific choices. You could be walking down the street, next thing you know, you're in jail. So those kinds of things, but that had to be done in code in a virtual space. On the other side, you had utopia, and these ideas that come out of the Dogon, looking at the universe, thinking about coming from, from Saturn in case of Sun Ra. All those things are genomics, where we're talking about tracing our lineage back to Africa. All of those things that are not necessarily this topic, but look at how we see ourselves now and where we're projecting ourselves. So I think you're going to find throughout, and whether it's Octavia Butler's writing or some visual art, you're going to find those two conflicts always. And I think that the problem is we don't support that type of work as across the country. And so we support certain types of work in popular culture, but not others. And so Hollywood sees that, or other people who have media outlets see that, and therefore they don't put us in the narrative. But that's sustaining the status quo. People oftentimes try not to change the narrative. So even if they say they are, if you look at the narrative never changes because they want the status quo to stay the same.
Bell Hooks, you remember when Bell Hooks said that Beyonce was a terrorist for young black women, and she's asking about how a statement like that might perhaps impact feminism's future, if we're talking about futurism.
So I think, as a scholar, as a black feminist who is also religionist, but also one deeply situated within black popular culture, I think there is room, and deeply inspired by Bell Hooks, but who loves Beyonce's music, right? I took my entire family, we went to see Beyonce and Jay-Z in concert, paid the price, that's how much we enjoy them, right? So there's a complexity there, but I think there's room for both what Bell Hooks has to say as well as Beyonce claiming her feminism, right? And I also think that there's a lot of room to critique Beyonce's feminism. I think she has a budding feminism that is growing, but yet, can't we Hello? Oh, okay. I thought this one. Why can't we celebrate her claiming, feminism for herself and what that means for her? I think there's a lot of room in terms of critiques of capitalism and patriarchy that I think she struggles with herself. But Beyonce also has these critical moments in her music, right, that give life to a variety of people. I'm thinking specifically when she talks about, I think in Bow Down Bitches, there's this point where she talks about, I think it's that song where she talks about, you think I'm just his little wife, like as if I don't matter anymore because I'm his little wife. But like she says, I'm his wife, but don't get it twisted, this is my shit. Right? So that's a very powerful statement in her claiming her own identity in the work that she's done. But yet there's room for her to be in conversation with the Bell Hooks. She has a lot to learn. right, about the feminist movement, but what I don't like is this kind of pushback, because I think that there's an issue with older generation, not all black feminists, but second wavers, where there's an issue with young black feminist sexuality and the claiming of sexuality. And I think it's important to claim that sexuality, but it's also important to claim that sexuality along with the history that it is also embedded in, right? So it has to be a very complex look. So there has to be a more nuanced conversation that I'm looking for that hasn't happened yet. But I am also deeply concerned about bell hooks using the language of terrorism, right? So I get that there's a particular kind of work that she's worried about that Beyonce may do in terms of putting her face and her brand, and connecting that to feminism. I think that that is a bit dangerous, but is it more dangerous than other feminist icons, or not feminist icons, but other entertainment icons like Madonna? Madonna did it too, right? But it didn't seem like there was this much anger around Madonna, right? Or even just other kinds of other kinds of figures. So I think that there's a conversation that's needing to happen that hasn't happened. My colleague Treva Lindsay she's doing some work now on black female sexuality and pop culture and this kind of popular feminism that is extremely nuanced. And I think that there needs to be room for new voices, because younger black feminists, we're hip hop. You know, we're of the hip hop generation. We have a different way of doing things. We get a little more crunk with it, right, than our older generation. We have a lot to learn from them, but we also have a different way of doing things. So there has to be more conversation around kind of where we are in terms of sexuality, and then where they are in terms of the knowledge and wisdom that they may bring to us.
You don't want to? I know. You want the last question? You sure? Yeah, I know. Do you want to comment? And that is something that the story kind of disappeared. The messenger disappeared, but the story's still out, and I think it relates to everything being said today. Thank you. Okay. One last question right here. Panels, because we got like maybe 3 minutes.
There's a piece called Lotus by the artist Sanford Biggers that I introduced to middle school students. It's basically a mandala, which is Buddhist, but it's also each petal of the mandala is a slave ship. So the teachers were concerned. They didn't think the students were able to analyze this image. And so I did it anyway because it's, it's my project. But what I found is not only were they able to look at this image and understand its meaning, that beauty comes out of something as bad as slavery. They were able to critically talk about why the artist put those two images together and what it meant on a very on a very spiritual and something about their self-esteem level. And I think that at some point that gets lost as they get older. So this idea of artists putting together, mixing syncretism, things that are seemingly disparate or different together in religion is something that's happening ongoing in Afrofuturism. And artists are doing that visually, but it also is in terms of what happens with lyrics and stories and such. So I think that it's there, and there's some real clear images, very simple, but I think that it creates conversations that need to be had about how we view the past and also where we're going in terms of cosmology and all that stuff, which I'll talk about later. But and I know we have very little time. So anyone want to talk about terrorism issue?
Well, with respect to the mysticism piece, mysticism is very close at hand. We have very natural connections to nature. We have very natural connections to the stars and the universe around us. And Afrofuturism, for me, is a way of facilitating the connection, kind of pushing through the stuff to have a relationship with that, because we're kind of conditioned to be separated from these very natural connections that we all have. So Afrofuturism is one way of facilitating that. With respect to the terrorism term, I mean, obviously that's a word that people are using to describe a host of things, from Beyonce to, very strong fertilizers. So I feel like we're just in an age where that's a very charged word, and it's being applied broadly for a host of situations because it generates a certain reaction. And I think that there's a lot of words in our culture that generate these strong reactions, and we just have to be cognizant of what the emotions we attach to these words and what that does to our consciousness, what it does to our actual ability to live and navigate what states of fear we function in because of the emotion that we attach to words. Even with the word terrorism in the case of Beyonce, I mean, there could have been a very valid point that was being made, but because that word was used, it creates a schism of sorts. So I'm just very big on what words we use and why, and what we associate with it and why. And I do feel Afrofuturism is a way to, again, one way to help break down some of these layers that we have that disconnect ourselves from our authentic self.
I think, just for a final point, I think one of the things that I agree, I think one of the things with bell hooks that we have to realize, and I think we all do realize, and why I fell in love with her, is that she uses language in a particular kind of way that is irreverent. It is to spark our thinking. It is to piss you off. It is to make you go back and rethink however you were thinking about X, Y, and Z. So I get, it makes, if we really sit with what she said, it does actually make sense, right? Because if you think of terrorism, terrorism is this act of violence, right? Act of violence against a collection of people. And if we think about some of the things, some of the messages, particularly with Beyonce, particularly around kind of capitalism, and also maybe even in some of the ways that she may express her sexuality, especially if she is reducing her identity to sexuality, right? I don't mean like in terms of her play and pleasure. I don't think bell hooks would have a problem with that, but if she is reducing her sexuality or her identity to that of sex, right, and sexuality, then that does create a certain kind of collective violence, right? So that's what I mean in terms of, so I wouldn't say that, shame on you, bell hooks, you shouldn't have said that. I mean, I have said that, but then as I've sat with it, right, I have, but then as I've sat with it in her body of work, I realized that she's making a very important statement, right? And she's making that statement in the way that only bell hooks can. And so we kind of have to sit with the truth of what she's saying and wrestle with that, as we also embrace the sexuality that Beyonce is embracing herself.
Okay, I'd like to thank our panelists. The next session will begin at 11, and it will, of course, feature George Clinton.